I'd like to start by thanking colleagues at Newcastle University for giving me the opportunity to give a short lecture on the topic of ageism and age stereotyping during COVID-19. For a social gerontologist, there's a lot that needs to be said about how questions around age and aging have played out during the course of the pandemic, such as the transformative nature of COVID-19. But we'll be thinking about a pre-COVID and a post-COVID gerontology in years to come. Giving a lecture in the middle of a crisis means that I'm bound to miss some key points and maybe not as nuanced as I usually would like to be. I'll cover three key themes. First, I'll say some words about the values that underpin my work on aging and shape how I approach the topic of ageism. Second, I'll consider what we mean by ageism. I can then highlight how age and aging have been represented in policy and in media. Third, I'll use the opportunity to present some ideas about what needs to happen next if we're to learn from the experience of COVID-19. But let's start with values. As in all scientific fields, researchers on aging approach their topics from a range of perspectives. I've come to appreciate the arguments of Martha Holstein and Meredith Minkler, who argued that research cannot occupy a value-free realm. It means that we all view the world and do our research with a view from somewhere. The view from nowhere, above the fray, doesn't exist any more in geological research than it does, for example, in physics. We choose our research topics, our conceptual tools, and methodological approaches because they align with our sense of who we are and what we want to be. Being above the fray is impossible when confronted by the COVID-19 crisis. But being above the fray has always been difficult for researchers who work within a so-called critical perspective on aging. This approach focuses on issues around social inequality and social justice. It draws attention to the diverse experiences of aging. It highlights issues of difference within older populations, marked by such factors as age, gender, race and ethnicity, social class, sexuality, and health status. Key to critical gerontology is its focus on the ways in which experiences in later life are shaped by structural and cultural processes that operate in wider society, whether this relates to the political system, social policies, or norms and expectations regarding aging. The approach demands that researchers not only engage with the issues, but they also seek to turn their ideas into action. It's against this background that I turn to the topic of ageism and age stereotyping. Social gerontologists have long recognized the prevalence of ageist attitudes in society. Robert Butler coined the term ageism in 1969, defining this as prejudice by one age group against another age group. 50 years on, there's still a lively debate about the idea of ageism. In a recent book, Liet Ayalon and Clemens Tesch-Römer define ageism as the complex, often negative construction of old age, which takes place at the individual and the societal levels. Ageism is regarded as one of the main forms of discrimination that remains widely tolerated in society. While researchers describe different forms of ageism, I still draw on the work of Julia Johnson and Bill Bytheway, who identify three types of ageism: institutionalized ageism, including legislative discrimination against people over and below specific ages; internalized ageism, including derogatory references to older people, and benevolent patronage, involving assumptions that older people are incapable of independent decision-making and need special protections. Before providing examples of forms of ageism and age stereotyping that have emerged during the pandemic, it's worth repeating some of the obvious ways in which COVID-19 affects older people. As I record this lecture, almost 35,000 UK deaths can directly be linked to COVID-19. This is an underestimate. A more accurate figure would be the 55,000 excess deaths recorded by the Office for National Statistics. In England, and in line with international data, 90% of all coronavirus deaths are of people aged 65 and over. These data are truly shocking, but equally shocking are the high numbers of deaths in care settings. To date, over 11,600 deaths linked to coronavirus have been recorded in UK care homes. Evidence suggests that there could be as many as 22,000 excess deaths in such places. Alongside these grim statistics, it's worth bearing in mind that most people of all ages survive COVID-19. Many of us have been greatly encouraged by news of people in advanced old age who have survived. But these data still provide a context for society's response to COVID-19. This is where deep-seated ageism and age stereotyping have been exposed. Let's start with the government's response. In any public inquiry that has to follow the pandemic, there'll be a strong focus on how older people have been affected. However, it's telling that the scientific group for emergencies doesn't appear to include anyone with expertise in geriatric medicine, let alone in social gerontology. If you look around government, you'd struggle to find anyone with knowledge or expertise on aging. This is just one example of an institutionalized form of ageism, and there are others. In the UK, initial suggestions were floated that all people aged 70 and over would be restricted to their homes. While this guidance was subsequently changed to focus on protecting people with underlying conditions, the damage was already done, and many older people have now spent 2 months or more locked down. In its statement on COVID-19 and ageing, the British Society of Gerontology, of which I'm currently president, urged government to reject the formulation and implementation of policy based on the simple application of chronological age. We argued that people can be vulnerable to COVID-19 at all ages. Not all people over the age of 70 are vulnerable. Not all those under 70 are resilient. Such approaches reinforce negative stereotypes of old age as being marked by vulnerability, frailty, ill health, disability. The ambiguity in recent statements about easing the lockdown for people under 70 suggests that government has yet to abandon its focus on chronological age as a policy tool. Other examples of institutionalized ageism exist in the shameful neglect of care homes and of the people who live and work in such settings. To protect the NHS, people were released from hospitals into care homes without having even been tested for coronavirus. People's contacts with loved ones have been severely curtailed. Care managers and workers have largely been left on their own, without guidance and support to deal with the unfolding crisis. Casualised and underpaid care workers continued to move in and out of care homes when the risks of infection were known. Serious issues remain in accessing personal protective equipment and testing, and other countries appear to have done so much better. Obviously, it's fortunate that the NHS was not overwhelmed at the peak of the pandemic. However, had it reached the point where difficult decisions were to be made about triaging patients and rationing access to life-saving treatment, then it was pretty clear that chronological age would have played at least some role in determining people's chances of survival. These are examples of institutionalized ageism in UK policy making. Despite notable reporting on age-related issues, other forms of ageism are evident in the mainstream media's reporting of COVID-19. Recent work by Hannah Swift and Ben Steeden reminds us of how media organizations shape and perpetuate negative attitudes and stereotypes of aging. We see this in countless examples of how older people have been represented as being vulnerable. We see this in the use of stock images that dehumanize people, reducing them to a series of body parts. We also see it in a focus on older people's apparent vulnerability to loneliness and in their inability to use digital technologies. This corresponds to benevolent ageism, the idea that older people can't fend for themselves and need special support based solely on their age. And we see ageism and age stereotyping in the use of language, directly in the media's dominant use of the term the elderly to describe a diverse older population, something which older people, age sector organizations, and gerontologists have long since rejected as deeply ageist. And we see it indirectly with reference to the ubiquitous underlying conditions that minimize the impact of excessive deaths, implying that many people who have died would have died anyway. And we've also seen a resurgence of unhelpful reporting that stokes generational divisions at precisely the time when solidarity is needed. Older people have variously been described and represented as a burden on health and care systems, as people who've done well during the crisis because their income and assets have been protected, and as people who should make a major financial contribution to getting the country back on its feet after the crisis. This type of reporting has a long tradition. Its main function is to distract from real sources of inequality within society, based largely on social class. A final, internalized version of ageism is seen when older people are stopped in the street and told that they should be staying indoors, when pharmacy staff suggest that an older woman should not be picking up her prescription, when older people's lives are viewed as being of less value to the lives of others. In the final part of my lecture, I'd like to sketch out potential strategies for responding to the challenges of ageism. In calling for a passionate scholarship, Holstein and Minkler expressed the hope for those of us committed to critical gerontology that we do whatever we do with passion and a belief that our scholarship can make a difference. That is, move people to action. There's a lot to be done if we're going to move people to action, but two options are available. Either we continue as before, or we chart a new course. In my view, returning to the old ways is unthinkable. We've experimented for too long with an individualized, ideological approach that puts the needs of the market ahead of the needs of people and communities. Since the late 1970s, we've seen the consequences of this approach in the weakening of social safety nets, the loss of social infrastructure, and growing inequalities. The neoliberal approach failed with the global financial crisis, failed again with the austerity program, and has failed even more spectacularly during COVID-19. It's an approach that fuels social divisions, including divisions between generations. So if we can't return to the old ways, what would a new post-COVID world look like? I've long held the view that the challenges and opportunities of ageing require a coordinated, cross-governmental approach. It's remarkable that the UK doesn't have anything resembling a strategy for demographic ageing. The lack of a coordinated approach has weakened our ability to respond to COVID-19, leading to a failure to protect lives. What we need is an ageing strategy, a strategy that builds on previous work. In my view, some of the building blocks would be work done by the Department for Work and Pensions in 2005 on its Opportunity Age document, and especially the Social Exclusion Unit's progressive Sure Start to Later Life report in 2006. We can also draw on international approaches, including the World Health Organization's work on age-friendly cities and communities, and its World Report on Aging and Health. Above all, any strategy should be underpinned by the voices of older people. But the experience of COVID-19 means that we need to go further. For a long time, there's been a debate in gerontology about the relative merits of a United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older People. Ironically, some of us have resisted the idea of a convention, primarily on the basis that it might cement forms of ageism, further identifying older people as being vulnerable and in need of special protection. However, in a post-COVID world, I think this hesitance will disappear. In the UK, but also more widely, we're witnessing the consequences of a structural disregard of older people's basic rights to life, to access health and care, and to live their lives in freedom. Age sector organisations have long advocated for a rights-based approach, but this has been resisted by successive governments. This has to change. How, as a society, can we tolerate a situation in which so many lives have been cut short? We need to secure a national commitment to developing a strategic approach to ageism. This should focus on respecting older people's rights, eradicating ageism and age discrimination, tackling the structural sources of inequality in later life, and renewing solidarity between older and younger generations. It's our joint challenge to draw on the disaster of the UK's response to COVID-19, to win the political argument, and to lay the foundations of a society that makes the most of demographic ageing. Thank you for listening.